Hello and welcome to our webinar, The Road to Better Plant Design, Episode 1. This webinar is brought to you by Applied Software. I'm Caitlin Dunn and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. This webinar is being recorded for your convenience. You'll be receiving an email with the recording link for future reference. Make sure to find Applied Software on social media to make meaningful connections, receive special offers, and stay up to date on the newest innovations. Also, be sure to visit our website, asti.com, to see how to achieve your design and business objectives through our innovative solutions, training options, and services. You can also find a complete schedule of upcoming events, webinars, and trainings on our website calendar, asti.com/calendar. All right, I am pleased to introduce today's presenters, Owen Whitehouse and David Wolf. Owen is a Senior Application Specialist at Applied Software, and David is a Director of Services at Applied Software. Both have years of experience in the industry. Thank you for joining us today, guys. Take it away.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Go ahead and share my screen.
Perfect, we can see it.
And boom, here we go. All right, so today we're going to start our episode 1, which is, yes, a nod to Star Wars. But we're going to start a conversation that we're going to have over the next several months around the road to better plant design. And so we want to just kind of set the stage for why are we having this conversation. So we decided to try this little experiment around, we're going to talk through a company. It is fictional, that does plant design. And so we're going to meet this company and learn how they, the problems that they run into when in their current plant design process. And then we're going to go through and kind of do a little bit of mock role play over the course of the next few months. And so we'll be releasing blog posts and other surveys and handouts around this to gather information about the types of things that you run into, to see if you kind of relate to this company and identify areas that we can optimize and work with. And so one of the tools, we're going to borrow a concept of retrospective. This has in agile development, that's what they call it, but there's also, you could call it lessons learned. But in the company, we're going to review a retrospective and see what outcomes they identified as critical issues for their project. And then today we're going to be talking about metrics and how we can make decisions with data and the role that plays in a company and how we move through projects. And then last of all, we'll leave off with some next steps as far as where we're going to go in this overall process. So this is really, it is the start of a journey for talking about plant design and how we improve it. And so that's what we're going to launch today. And on to the company. So we're going to meet Julie Sanders. She's an engineering manager. And so she has an eye on all the projects that are going on in our client company. And next we also have Paul Miller, and I'll go ahead and let you read those descriptions. Paul is a piping lead. And so typically, as a former piping designer and from a piping designer perspective, this is the role we're most comfortable with. We're comfortable with talking with piping leads and people who have their hands on the software. And so we want to kind of help start to facilitate a conversation between people who are often in that role, and talk about how we can influence management and how management can work together, how we work as a team in an environment within our company to improve plant design. Because as designers and as engineers in general, you know, my tendency and our tendency is to focus on details, and it's really good for us to do that, and that's how we build things. But sometimes we can get too focused on the details. And so part of the conversation between designers and the business side needs to be focusing on problems that are significant enough to cause major headaches. And so if we're solving a problem that is costing us 5 or 10 minutes, that's not generally too big of an issue. But when we start to talk about problems that are maybe costing us weeks off of schedule, or maybe there are actions that there might be small, maybe they're a 30-second action, but it, you know, if you look throughout the organization, it might happen 10,000 times a year. Well, that starts to be a big impact. And so we really want to help facilitate this conversation around bringing together all the parties to help design and decide on a better process. And so one of the other key roles in that is going to be project management. And so we have Dylan in this role as a project manager. So project managers often have the challenge of being hands-in. They're very client-facing. They have a lot of need for data and communication. And so Dylan's going to provide a perspective on that and help us make sure we understand how the communication process is affecting the schedule, the costs, and then also the subcontractors and the client. And we're doing this in the context of an owner-operator facility. So many times, plant design is everywhere. We have so many different EPCs, owner-operators, there's small shops, there's large shops, all kinds of people are doing piping design. And so we wanted to focus on an owner-operator facility. And so we selected the one, again, it's fictional. The names have been changed to protect the innocent and the guilty, because we have all been guilty at some point. But we want to talk about a company that really cares about developing their chemical processes in a smart way. And so this is just one example we selected.
Let's keep in mind here too, David, that this road to better plant design is, we have a lot of topics to cover here, and this first episode is basically the definition of better. And what better means is something that's different for every role in the organization. So that's why we've got these 3 roles that we're going to explore a little more fully as we go through this series. Just keeping in mind that what means better for Julie is probably going to be very different than what better means for Paul. So, and we're probably there's a few other roles here that, we're going to touch on that aren't defined here. But for example, maybe your director of engineering or someone at a C-level in your organization, they also have a different definition of better. So we can't really have a good conversation about better plant design until we actually kind of get everyone aligned on what better really means. So that's really the focus of this first episode, I think.
Yep, exactly. And so we see a lot of common scenarios when we talk about owner operators, and that's around the project size. It's very common for them to focus on doing smaller projects in-house. Maybe if it's less than 30 million, they'll keep it in-house. And then if it's a larger size, they'll contract it out to an EPC. And so, when there's a single person in a company, it's pretty hard to automate and pretty hard to do a lot of optimization, but they can definitely start there. But we're targeting, a company that has, or a facility that has, a group of maybe 3 to 5 or 10 designers on staff. Also, one common problem is they're going to have a lot of legacy drawings and a lot of legacy data from different CAD systems. And so that has its own issues with maintaining that and with developing it. And then there's always, with whatever current system that they're using, maybe they use the enterprise design software package, but due to licensing costs, they're now having to switch to something else. And so currently this company is using AutoCAD block libraries because they had a bunch of list routines that helped with that process. And so they're using that. So that's kind of the context of the project size and the CAD implementation that they have right now. So they're jumping into what Julie and Paul and team have done is recently they've done a heat recovery project. And so their process engineering team identified a need for this. And so I've identified the issues, and they're going through and building out a perspective on how the project went. Owen, you got more to add about that?
Yeah, so I guess the thing that really brought these types of conversations up is something that we've been approached with repeatedly throughout the years when we're interacting with clients, and that is how do you have this conversation around why I should use different tools, what tools you were using, and how do you differentiate? So what, kind of back to this idea of what better means. And so from the context of the average company, that's really what our Acme Process Fluids is. They're doing their P&IDs in just regular AutoCAD, just the way so many other companies are. They've got a backlog, a legacy of lots of different models, varying levels of completion and as built around their facility. So they're really in the same situation that we find a lot of our clients in. So we're going to have that conversation around what does it mean to them to change software and go to a whole different way of doing P&IDs. So in future conversations we'll address those things more directly. But so I think it's important to just recognize that we've done this enough times now. We've recognized that this company Acme is going to kind of represent where we're seeing a lot of interest and activity in plant design. And basically, we're going to take you through the process of how we would help them identify what they need to do to get to better plant design.
Exactly. And so a lot of people have challenges even envisioning what it looks like to have someone like Applied Software come alongside and help them. And so this is kind of a way you can do a virtual walk along and see what the process is like and get comfortable with it before you commit to it. All right. So first of all, let's talk about performance metrics. And so, this is something that's going on all over, right? In all of the business sectors. Data is a big deal, all the way from what you shop for to how you run your house. It's just becoming part of our everyday life. And so, and even internally at Applied Software, we're looking at data and how we can use it to drive decisions and trying to make sure we're tracking the right things. And there's some things that we've identified as really key in how we approach this. So when you talk about numbers and metrics, it tends to go deep pretty quick. But I want to take a little bit of time to shift to the personal in our outlook a little bit, because we really have to understand that data can be interpreted a lot of ways. There is sometimes a temptation to use it to hammer people, and we can't do that because then it shuts down the conversation. So we also need the honesty for it. So like we need to be willing to stick to our guns and say, this is really what happened, however painful it is. The project really did take this long. We really ended up, we missed big, but this is what happened. And then after that honesty, you can come in with curiosity to figure out, well, what really actually happened, and how do we change that, or what solutions can we come up with to measure different things. But without these two key attributes, it really kind of sets you up for having a harder environment to execute in.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway here, just at the very highest level, is this concept around engineering, and I think we've all experienced it, that engineering is very failure averse. So there's no scenario in which an engineer is going to be satisfied saying, this didn't work. I failed on this task. My calculations were wrong, whatever. So that's spilled over into our management of projects, and that's unfortunate because we're really now at this point unwilling to say, what, that project timeline slid terribly. But I managed to get the client to sign off on the revised baseline. So we're okay. We did fine. Well, did you really? And are you having an honest conversation at that point? So I think that's really the focus here on performance metrics is, can we be honest with ourselves and say, this actually went badly, or this actually went well, and then use that honesty to look at the data you have available without doing any extra work. Just look at the data available and say, can I get some good numbers out of this to show me where I can improve on my next project?
Yeah, and so that's kind of like just surfaces, even personally, when I see some numbers thrown up like on statistics like this, like 85% or 75%, my natural inclination is go, really? I don't know. And you start just diving into thinking where it might be wrong. And so just, we want to be in a place with performance metrics to where we can see a number and we know the process in the background and the work that's going on behind creating that number. There's validation happening. There's checking, this becomes part of our normal daily life, is to evaluate the metrics and how we generate them. And so that once we see these numbers, we can be very comfortable in saying, yes, this is, good, bad, or whatever. This is what we did. And this is an accurate thing. And it's a real thing that we can work from. So that gets us all to kind of a starting baseline. And it brings us in, kind of makes the makes the playing field a little level, so that we're all working off and against the same baselines like Owen mentioned. And so along with this, though, this idea of honesty and just being able to work towards a place where we're comfortable seeing metrics like this, and we don't have harsh reactions to judge them or prejudge them, we want to discover and talk about how do metrics change what we do. And so this is very, like Owen was mentioned, is very tied to personas and roles and how people are perceiving things. And so when we see things, or when we can deliver metrics around project profitability, who cares about that? And what's the role that cares about that? And how are they going to be using that number? And so being able to see project profitability is going to let us shift maybe our focus, because if our projects are all across the board profitable, maybe it's time to diversify. Or maybe there's time to, we need to focus on selling and grow our sales side. And like, even if we see overtime hours, what set of decisions could people make differently?
Right. So these are numbers that, somebody probably in your organization probably cares about already. But are they being widely communicated, and are you aware of them as an overall project metric? How many times have I completed a project and moved on to the next one, and I never found out if the project I worked on before was profitable? Were we in the red? Were we in the black? I don't know. I was running pipe and managing designers, so I never knew. Overtime hours, it's a simple metric, but it can highlight some fundamental issues with how you're executing your projects.
Yeah, and it really does tie back. Like, there is definitely the role that just needs to keep their head down and do work, but giving them the opportunity to take a breath, see the context, gives them a lot more comfortable with a lot more comfort with the value of the work that they're creating, and that you're able to tie it to the overall company goals, and you're able to tie it to the overall success, helps them have more stickiness with your company. And so there's even things like revisions. When we see that there's a lot of revisions, generally that means conversations didn't happen early enough in the process, right? Because usually it's a new set of eyeballs got a hold of the drawings and had a bunch of markups.
Yeah, but the main takeaway here, David, is that we're trying to illustrate that you can get metrics on how you're executing your projects to help you define what a better plant design process would be without a lot of extra work. You probably have numbers from your accounting team on profitability. It's fairly easy to go to HR and say how many overtime hours were put on this project. It's really easy to go to your CAD manager and go into your document management system and say, what's my average number of revisions per drawing? So the takeaway here is the metrics are all right in front of you. You just have to start thinking in that, having that mindset that I'm going to look at a lot of different things. How many files did I create in this particular project? Can I associate number of drawing files and models to the dollar value of the project? All kinds of things become available when you realize that you can get a fair amount of information and build some performance metrics without having special software like Plant 3D, running in the background with a full database. But what we're trying to build here is this idea that if you're going to do performance metrics and use that to help you make better decisions going forward with plant design, getting started here is easy, and then we can show you the next step with using something like Plant 3D, where you've got the data behind the scenes, and now we can get some really exciting information going.
Exactly. And so this is we're just highlighting the role of performance metrics, that there are ways to get them easily without a bunch of extra work. It does take creativity and conversation to do that. But what that is going to do is that's going to let us fill in a decision gap. And so what we see commonly, and we run into a lot of clients like this who have done a good job identifying their issues. And so we're going to run through in the next slide some of the common issues we hear about, but many companies are able to step aside and say, do a little bit of retrospective or a little bit of lessons learned and say, here's our core issues, and they name big 4 or big 5, or maybe there's just 2 or 3. But then there's a gap, and the gap is between identifying solutions and then implementing the fix for those metrics, or the fix for the issue those metrics identify. And so the goal here is to use those metrics and to fill in the gap with data. So there's a lot of ways that we do this now in different scenarios. We use might be hunches. Sometimes it's just a gut. Go with your gut. We hear that a lot. I think this is the right thing to do, so let's try it and see if it fixes it. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But it's very just kind of, emotion and gut driven. Really, the next common thing that we see is people using experience, and that is definitely a valid method of making decisions. The challenge is when things are changing. So the way we did plant design 20 and 30 years ago is very different from what we're doing now, and it's going to keep changing at a fast pace. And so you can't always just rely on experience, and maybe this problem is a little bit different than the other one, and it might be different in a critical way. Another way people use another method people use to bridge that gap is community. If I have a friend at a different company, or if I have a network that I can rely on that has a lot of experience as well, we bounce ideas off of them. But that obviously depends on your social network and how accessible they are. And then that's why we're highlighting data here as what fills that gap, because data lets you use your internal processes and internal coordination. And then it also lets you spread that information out among people in your company so that you all can build a consensus about the right steps and what you're testing and trying. And so maybe there's another group that does similar work to you, and they can try one thing and you can try the other and do a little bit of A/B testing and then both validate what works. And so we do that internally with our services. We talk about our other services group, we test strategies in one and test a different strategy in another. And then that lets us go compare notes and move forward. And so having data as a backbone for conversation makes sure that is communicated effectively and it's durable. We're all aware of an aging workforce, but we want to be able to make decisions and make them in a way that people coming after us can kind of follow in the steps. And so data provides the opportunity to make that types of persistent change and keep that value and store that value.
Yeah, it really comes down to the concept of, are you going to make a change based on some measurable factors inside your organization, or are you going to make a change just because you feel like it would be the right thing to do? Like, just to give a perfect example, we have a lot of companies who realize that they're entitled to use Plant 3D because they already have the licenses. They've been using some other tools or maybe no tools at all. And so they come to us and they say, we want to use Plant 3D. And we're happy to help them with that. But if you take just a small step back and take a look at their process, have they actually validated, or have you actually validated that using a tool like Plant 3D was the right step forward? Now, I'm willing to bet it almost always is, but do you have metrics, and can you show that after you implemented it and you got it all stood up and working, that you're actually doing better work? Are you getting your projects out the door faster? Are you all the things that go with, quote unquote, better are measurable, but are you measuring them? And before you start down the road of implementing something like Plant 3D, it's a really nice idea to take some baseline measurements and make sure that's a repeatable thing that you can use going forward to communicate to your managers or your C-level staff. That money we spent on, taking the team offline to train on this software, this was money well spent, and here's why.
Exactly. It's great for your career too, because you'll have that perspective to show and the success. So let's jump over into things that I think we have all heard about and run into on most of our projects, right? And these are the things that Acme Process Fluid is discovering as they had their lessons learned or their retrospective. And these are very standard. Again, we all run into these, but the desire to have less rework, because when a vendor changes a drawing, whether it's nozzles or the pump changed, or maybe even they just completely switched out pumps, then you have different dimensions. And so all of that stuff is impacted. And so looking at the ways that we can measure that, less rework, we can look at how many drawings were impacted and how many revisions were created out of those. Owen, what are your thoughts on the schedule part?
So from a retrospective standpoint, I think we make a critical mistake when working with schedules, and I alluded to this earlier, but this comes back to that honesty topic you brought up earlier. From a retrospective standpoint, so many of the organizations that I've worked in that had, good, well-managed schedules still fell into this trap of rationalizing failures to maintain project schedules. So despite the fact that everything finished quote unquote on schedule, so the client had signed off on multiple revisions to the baseline schedule, the reality is when you sat down and did your initial baseline schedule, and then you failed to meet that for whatever reason, whether it was a scope change, whether it was invalid vendor information, whatever caused that to happen, we've got to be honest here and say my baseline is my baseline is my baseline. So if I'm going to look at shorter schedule, I can't get shorter schedule. If I'm going to look back at a project, and if I can't get a shorter schedule, if I don't take the time to say, what was my initial estimate of the schedule and what actually caused me to miss that schedule? Now, if I did baseline revisions after that and I basically washed away all that sin under the bridge and said, this was all fine, we were actually on schedule, that isn't actually going to help you address what your engineering and plant design situations are that would help you actually stick on the baseline. And there's all kinds of effects after that. If you're actually meeting your initial baselines, then you can forecast your work better. You can resource your teams better. You can accept that other project that was kind of on the back burner and you didn't know if you'd had enough time to do it. So this is really important, but this comes back to honesty. So I guess that's my big thought on shorter schedules.
There we go. Definitely. And then the next item we identified is collaboration. And this is a buzzword of sort, but it really does become key because you see so many times stuff just happens, right? And how do we handle that change? And how do we handle the need for more conversations? And sometimes there are ways that we can minimize that, but if we don't measure what the effect is, we'll never know how much we're losing just to collaboration. And so we want to make sure that when we do collaborate with people, it's effective, and then it actually solves the problem and we don't create new ones. And so measuring your RFI process, and this gets a little bit deeper and into weeds, but just looking at how many times people are asking for emails, because most of the time, if like there's a transmittal and someone loses a drawing, I mean, how many times have we been in scenarios where someone was on the wrong revision? That's like almost every time almost. We have to go through and make sure everyone has the right version of the file printed out. And so, we need to look at metrics for capturing that. And then another big one is material takeoff, and just making sure that you can order well ahead so that you're not, when it comes time to execute and to build, you're not stuck waiting for parts. And so that can have a big impact on how your long lead items come out, how long it takes to build your takeoffs, and measuring those aspects.
Yeah, just to jump back to collaboration, David, this can actually become a huge black hole in your organization. So given a certain project size, it's a fairly natural correlation between the amount of dollars that, the dollar value of the project and the amount of, communication that, resulted, in that project. So if you're not tagging emails or using some system to track the amount of conversation and back and forth that goes on between your design team and all the other companies and individuals you're working with, say your construction managers and your the site superintendent, just all that communication, if you're not kind of correlating that to your dollar value, you can very quickly, or if you are, you can very quickly get an overview of how good was your initial project documentation, how tight was your design. Because if there's tons of communication on a small project, that to me says, well, you know what, we kind of missed. Our documents weren't very good, our drawings weren't clear.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of RFIs came in. So this retrospective, again, we can data drive this collaboration retrospective by looking back into your your emails. Maybe you just do a keyword search or something, but even better, start tagging things. So that's just it's one of those massive time sucks that all gets, chalked up to your engineering administration overhead. But
Mhm.
really, if you tag it against a project, you can start to see where your efficiency problems are.
Yeah, definitely. So the next we want to kind of dive into the metrics and how do metrics help this part. And so we'll walk through a little bit of the hierarchy, because each persona has a different perspective and they care about different things like we referenced earlier. And so just like when we're talking about business plans, we're talking about like at the 10,000 feet level. And for the most part, designers don't care about that. But we do need to be able to provide metrics on what we do for the 10,000 foot level. And so we've identified some roles and personas, and we'd love to hear some feedback on this about like, what do you report to your C-level? Do you report on budget or schedule? At the management level, you're a lot of times they're concerned about resourcing for people and materials or the work processes. Project managers will often care about the task churn, how often the same task is being repeated. RFI count, like we mentioned earlier, and they're checking on communication. And for estimation, like Owen mentioned, a lot of times the estimators have a big role in defining the schedule to some degree, because they bid the work. And so do you compare your estimates to your final project and seeing whether you're on schedule, whether you're on budget, whether you've the stages that were defined were executed within the stages? And then at the designer level, we care about things like how many pieces of equipment do we need to model, or how many lines are there, or how many specs are we working with? Those are all things that affect the day-to-day work that we're doing in the product in Plant 3D. And so we want to make sure that when we do capture these things, and when you're starting to talk about what better plant design looks like, you're approaching it from the point of view from each role in the organization. Let's see, the next part, it would be guidelines. And so we've tried to give a few examples of ways that you can capture metrics, like looking at emails, capturing RFI count. And we wanted to run through a few guidelines that we feel like are very important in thinking about this. First of all is you need to brainstorm. The thing that we find most helpful is brainstorming to find the questions to ask, because again, with the data background engineer, sometimes I just start diving into numbers and then I'm like, oh, well, let me look at this. Let me look at this. So I start looking at the data just because I enjoy the data. But actually figuring out what are the important questions helps minimize the time and the amount of work you spend just finagling stuff and data. And so finding the right question to ask and building a list of those might take a collaborative process with several people from different teams and different roles. And then they need to apply their creativity, because like Owen was saying, you want to make this easy. You want to make this, see what data you already have available, see what things you're already doing, and build your metrics out of that, because that's the natural way to get the numbers without affecting people's work. Because anytime you have to affect someone's actual day job to get data, it's going to be a roadblock, and it's going to make them feel a little bit hesitant, because it's going to it's going to impact them significantly. I want to know, what else can you think of for guidelines?
Well, I guess I like to tie conversations like this back to some real world scenarios. So we often get asked by companies to come in and help them redevelop their pipe specs or develop a new pipe spec for them. And, there's a dollar value attached to that. And then some companies, when they see the dollar value, the amount of time, and money it's going to take to develop a good piping spec, they'll back off. And they're like, well, I think we can get by with what we've been doing. But have you actually, when you sat down with us to talk about, I need this pipe spec, have you actually gathered any information on whether or not this actually is a value to your organization? Now, it usually is. Having good pipe specs, we all know that's really important. But what was the effect of not having a good pipe spec on your last project? Can you capture and measure that? It's actually pretty easy to do if you think about it, but unless you've done it, it's maybe hard to sit down with your manager and have a conversation to say, I think we've got these 6 pipe specs that need to be built outside our organization. How can we do that? Can we pay for that? But if you don't come also with the information to say, this was the cost in our last project of not having those good pipe specs, and this is the amount of rework that we had to endure, and the extra cost to the project, and maybe lost some profitability that because we didn't have good pipe specs. So just a simple thing like, and this could, there's 100 different other examples, but
Mhm.
this is the metrics gap. This is the problem, is we're relying on our intuition and sense of what needs to be done or what needs to be improved to help us drive our better plant design process forward. But if you just take a few minutes and just try to look at what you've already got going on, pull some data out of those systems that you already have available to you. Again, simple things like how many files did you create for your last project? Can you get any useful information out of that? This is where that metrics gap can be closed up.
Mhm. It is very important, like Owen was saying, with the spec example, let's say, for example, sometimes we approach that in a linear fashion. So like if you got a set of new specs, you might say, we need to, for this project, it's gonna take 3 weeks for us to build these specs in-house. And if that starts happening consistently, then all of your projects are behind and you're losing 3 weeks off your schedule. Whereas if, as a business, you can take an approach and say, all right, we're going to really put a priority on having specs disconnected from our project process. And maybe we're going to set a goal of doing a quarterly release or a quarterly review of specs so that they change maybe only 4 times a year. And then the projects aren't dependent on those as much. And so, if you can capture the cost in that effort, then that helps you validate a lot of other things. Also, the metrics is the first argument for automation. So the first, I guess, as I think about this in stages of development, the answer for efficiency is always standardization, right? Because every time we do things different ways, we're costing ourselves time because we're going to do it differently. And so if we can build in, though, a manual workflow first, then that gives us something we can measure. And so after we do that and we successfully migrate our workflows or work processes from everyone doing 15 different ways, if we can streamline one of them and we get them doing the manual thing one way, then we can look at that cost and say, all right, is that manual workflow, is that taking too long? What parts of this can we automate? And automation is always some sort of spend, but it gives you your time back. And so this metrics really is key, not just in how we're reporting our projects and how we're working together, but also the future, like of automation and how we really do start to optimize and start cutting, multiple magnitudes off of our work schedules and our time. And that is, I believe that's the conversation. So we really wanted to spend some time, dive down into metrics and how it can impact the business, and kind of review some of those thoughts and those processes. The next episode is going to be covering what we do as we work through evaluation processes. And so in this journey of identifying the problems and identifying the 4 major buckets we're looking at, we need to find tools that help solve those problems. And so we're going to provide some guides and some collateral around helping you estimate and evaluate which tool is the best one to use. And so this is not going to necessarily just apply to Plant 3D, but also it'll apply to several different things. And so this is the next stage, and that will cover that, of reviewing the tools and also some of the strategies for implementing changes. And so how do you approach it from eat the whole elephant one time or take a bite sort of strategies? And so we'll be working through that. You'll see that over the next few months, and then we'll also wrap this up with some customer stories. And we'll bring in some clients who have had success and have been improving their plant design processes for a long time, and get a little snapshot on what they feel like they've done good and what they would keep improving over the next few years. So thank you for joining us. Owen, any last comments, or Caitlin, any last comments?
Oh, sounds good. Looking forward to seeing everybody for the next one.
Ooh, yeah, I can go ahead and wrap it up, guys. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was awesome. Thanks everybody out there for tuning in. We appreciate you spending your time with us, and we trust that it was meaningful and impactful for you and your business. We look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.